Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to have a look at the third ship on the US tour that I conducted early in April this year. Now, of course, we've seen USS Constitution, and we've seen USS Salem, and about an hour's drive south from USS Salem was, of course, Battleship Cove, home of USS Massachusetts, Hidden Sea, USS Lionfish, USS Joseph P. Kennedy, a variety of other small craft, and a museum. But, well, this was the view from the RV as we began to pull up into the area, and, well, it was the first battleship I'd ever physically seen in person, and the first battleship I was going to step aboard, so of course it was going to be a bit special. Now, when you board USS Massachusetts, you board on the starboard side of the fantail, so that's aft. And you're presented with this view of the aft triple 16-inch turret, although if you look very closely, I mean, it's a bit more obvious on the right-hand side there, but each of the guns is aimed at a slightly different angle, which technically makes this a 3-gun turret, because very technically speaking, a 3-gun turret has independently elevating guns. A triple turret would have them all locked together, which Massachusetts does not have. But something that I hadn't appreciated on any of the museum ships I'd been on before is just how wide a battleship is. Now, I know those of you who live in the States have probably been aboard these ships multiple times thinking, oh, what's the big deal? But, you know, even as large as Salem was, she was a cruiser. And obviously Belfast in the UK is also a cruiser. And those ships tend to have fairly large length to beam ratios, whereas the battleships are a lot beamier. And so you step onto the fantail of Massachusetts and you're struck by just how much open space there is. And bear in mind, these photos aren't taken from right aft on the ship. This is probably about half to 2/3 of the way down the fantail. Okay, yes, camera perspective is playing a little bit, but seriously, I spent a good 30 seconds going, wow, this is a big ship, even though intellectually, obviously, I understood that the South Dakotas were the shortest of the 3 types of fast battleships I was going to see on the tour. It's still a fairly important moment. And if you look over the starboard side, you can see some of the other ships that are there. So there's the Joseph P. Kennedy on the right, Lionfish here in the middle, and you can see Lionfish has some fairly extensive prop guards going on there at the stern. And then you can see just a little sign there, which is for the Hidden Sea, which is better seen in this photo. So these are the other 3 major ships that you can, or in the case of the Lionfish, boat, that you can go and see at Battleship Cove, which makes admission quite the bargain if you have a day, or, well, to be honest, probably a couple of days to look round everything. Now, the next thing I noticed, having turned back to look at the aft of Massachusetts, was all the systems, and my little engineer's heart and my companion historian's heart, which technically makes me 2 hearts, which makes me either a Time Lord or a Space Marine, but never mind, went, systems! I get to look at all the systems! I mean, just look at it here. There's a quad 40mm Bofors down there. There's at least 3 different types of radar, mountings for various other things, and I think there's at least 1 Orlican in this picture as well. And then you edge just a little bit around the turret, and oh look, there's even more stuff, even more radar. There's the 5-inch 38s on the port side. Obviously, they're also on the starboard side as well. There's just so much to see, and I hadn't even left the fantail yet, which was quite fun. And whilst I was on the fantail, I was also met by a number of wonderful people, some of whom I'd seen before, some of which were new to me. So I met Megan Rathburn, the Executive Director of USS Massachusetts, who is a absolutely wonderful person, and as of the time of recording of this video, I was also able to catch up again with at the HNSA conference later in the year, and she's doing a fantastic job looking after Battleship Cove. Welcomed me aboard. We discovered a mutual interest in medieval history as well, so expect hopefully at some point I'll be able to talk with her about medieval naval history just as much as Massachusetts. And I was also met with a range of USS Massachusetts staff, and as I said, a few familiar faces, because it turned out, despite the fact that we were on a fairly hectic tour, Dr. Scholes had beaten us there. And you might remember I've sung the praises of Dr. Scholes a few times before on the channel, including, of course, on the video on USS Salem. And he was down at Massachusetts to show me around this ship as well. And I was just like, great, fantastic. There's even more things to learn. This is, all things are coming up Drach today. And speaking of which, I do need to reply to his email because I did receive it. And yes, definitely going to be popping back over to the US early in the new year, next year, 2023, to talk more about fire control. So yeah, really looking forward to that. Anyway, now as with all of the ship tours that we're looking at on the US tour that I did, I won't be showing you absolutely everything that we saw and heard. Well, for one thing, it's impossible to explore the full length and depth of the ship in a single day. But for two, as I've mentioned in other videos, please go and see the ships. Support them by visiting, have a look yourself, and that way the ships stay around for longer for everybody. So you'll see some of the highlights of the tour. In the next section you're going to see, which was recorded aboard, I do misspeak slightly. So to sort of forestall people in the comments, the shell head that you'll see towards the end of the upcoming video clip, it is from Jean Bart, the French battleship, but it was not fired by Jean Bart. It was actually fired by Massachusetts. It came from Jean Bart in as much as they fished it out of Jean Bart and brought it back to Massachusetts. So that's a slight mess up on my part. I apologise. But with that said, let's have a look at some of the shells that they have available for viewing around the rear turret. So that's turret 16-3. Okay, so here we are under Massachusetts aft 16-inch turret. You might be wondering what this is. This is a 16-inch shell, but it's not just any 16-inch shell. There are quite a few of them. This one is a 16-inch Mark V, and you might notice it looks like a giant bullet. Of course, it isn't a giant bullet. You might be wondering, where's the big, long, pointy bit that you usually see on top of them? Well, that's the windscreen. That's designed to help it fly through the air nice and fast without losing speed. This is the business part. When the shell actually hits the ship, the windscreen's going to disintegrate like so much tin foil. This is the hardened cap. This is the thing that does the actual penetration. So this being a Mark V, this could be fired by any US battleship in World War II that had a 16-inch gun. So you had the Mark III shells on the Colorados. The Mark Vs could be fired by the Colorados, the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, which is what we're on now, and the Iowas. But the fast battleships, the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, and the Iowas, could also fire a different shell, which is what we're going to go and see now. So this is a US Mark VIII 16-inch shell. As you can probably tell, it's a slightly larger shell. It weighs a lot more. It's a super heavy shell. And again, this is missing its windscreen so that you can see what the actual shell looks like. And as our guides kindly pointed out, this is a Mod 3. So this armor-piercing cap here is different to the one we saw on the Mark V, but the later mods of the 16-inch Super Heavy would have a different armor-piercing cap again, which would get even blunter to help it penetrate armor at better angles. And obviously you can see here where the windscreen would have fitted on, but this is just your Mark VIII. And then we duck under the 16-inch 45 caliber gun, which also, interestingly enough, is better at armor penetration through decks than the Iowa's 16-inch 50 guns because it fires at a slightly lower velocity. And I was just informed by the experts here that actually the Iowas had special cams put into their fire control systems and special charges so that they could replicate the muzzle velocity of a 16-inch 45 with the 16-inch 50 guns to enable them to have better armor penetration against decks at what we would call mid to long range. So this is perhaps what you'd think of more conventionally as a battleship shell, much more pointy, but obviously this has the windscreen on. So this is what it would look like going out, but as far as a target is concerned, what we saw back there is doing the actual business. And then this thing, which looks a little bit deformed. As you may know, USS Massachusetts fought various French warships at the Battle of Casablanca during Operation Torch. This is what's left of a shell that came in from Jean Bart. So this is a French battleship shell, or at least what's left of it. And you can see the sheer amount of force involved in battleship engagements because this is a solid lump of metal. This was pretty hard when it was fired. But as you can see, the impact energy has this thing rippling like water, and of course it's broken up. So this is just what we're seeing on the exterior of turret 3 on Massachusetts this morning. So let's see what else we can find. So once again, just have a look at that shell, that, as I mentioned in the video, it was hardened steel heading out, and just look at the complete transformation. You know, it's not just gone through one state of change. You can see you've got scalloping, you've got rippling, and then you've got this kind of molten bubbling going on at the end. The sheer amount of energy involved in a battleship shell impact is immense. And at least for an engineer, and hopefully for you at home as well, this really brings it home much more than a lot of descriptions could do. Now, of course, the next thing to do would be to go inside one of the big 16-inch turrets, see what's going on in there, and see just how much space there is. Now, again, bear in mind, up until this point, I've been in HMS Belfast turret, which is relatively roomy for the size that it is. I've been in Salem's turret, which is bigger, but actually, in terms of overall available floor space, slightly more cramped, although that's to be expected since it's full of auto-loading equipment. And now we're going into a battleship turret, which is bigger still, but doesn't have the auto-loading equipment. So would it be roomier inside than either of the cruiser turrets? Spoiler alert, no, there is not a huge amount of space inside. This is probably the second largest bit of, if you like, empty space inside the turret, and this is right at the back of it. Now, there's a lot of machinery, a lot of equipment, a lot of wiring that you can see, but over here on the left, you can also see this big grey tube. Now, that is part of the rangefinder that's fitted to this turret as a backup to a backup to a backup to a backup. And of course, having been presented with the single biggest rangefinder I'd ever seen up to this point, I of course had to take a look and see what I could see. Now, I said this was a backup to a backup to a backup to a backup. It's a huge piece of kit. It pretty much subdivides the turret. It's a rather difficult passage to get from this side of it to the business end of the turret. But this, if you're using it in battle, means that things have gone horribly wrong. Because by the mid-war, when Massachusetts is in commission, she's got radar, she's got multiple gun directors of varying descriptions, and she's also actually got multiple radars as well. So all of these would have to have gone down for the turret crew to actually have to resort to the optical range-finding equipment within the turret itself. Now, of course, South Dakota-class battleships did occasionally have reason to use these rangefinders, or attempt to use them. USS South Dakota, during Admiral Lee's battle with Kirishima, tried to use them. Unfortunately, there was so much on fire that all you could see through these lenses here on South Dakota, obviously, was smoke and flames. But the fact it was there once the smoke and flames had died down, they at least had something to use. And of course, off of Casablanca, South Dakota could use these to check ranges that had been estimated by the various systems higher up in the ship. And also, it was one of the very few ways that the gun crew of the ship could actually see and what was going on outside. This is the amount of headspace you have above the rangefinder, so that is the turret roof just above, and we're looking, as I say, further down into the business end of the turret, so you have to go under the rangefinder, which is a little bit of a task. It's not too difficult for the able-bodied, but it certainly adds a little bit of extra level of difficulty trying to get to your action station, you can believe that. Now, on the other side of the rangefinder, there's also this little device, which is obviously a single lens periscope, effectively, that allows you to see out of the top of the turret, and this would be in use during battle by somebody in the turret, usually probably the turret captain, but other people could check things as well. And you'll notice that on the right there is a dial which allows you to select a variety of filters, because of course daylight or night levels of light may be very, very different. And so in order to get a clear picture and not blind yourself, you can protect your eyes by selecting the appropriate setting. And there you can see it in context. It's the little thing in the middle up top there. So just on the right, that kind of brass platform, that's where you come across underneath the rangefinder. And this is the other major open space within the turret, which, considering how large the turret is not very much at all. To your left, you can see a little doorway, and that is what leads through to the guns. And again, so much equipment in here. Wires, pipes, electronic systems, etc., etc. And they have one of the guns set up in the process of loading. So you can see here 3 out of the 6 bagged charges are visible, because the other 3 are already inside the gun. And you can see the rammer down here, which is extending into the brass loading tray. So the charges would have arrived along the hoist system, they would have been placed in this loading tray, and then once everything is set up and ready to go, this rammer, which is obviously hydraulic, starts to move the charges in. And that process is controlled by this lever here. So fairly simple instructions. You pull it down to ram the charges in, and once it's placed them within the breech of the gun, then you withdraw the rammer because you don't want that sealed in by the breech block. And it is fascinating how all that complex machinery comes down in some ways to just, a simple lever to get things in the place they need to be. Now you notice the red patch on the charge here where the rammer head is. Now that is the priming pad, so that's the somewhat more sensitive part of the charge that will be detonated in order to detonate everything else that's in there. And so the rammers have to be calibrated to move relatively swiftly, because you want the loading process to be done as quickly as possible, but not too swiftly or too violently that you end up setting it off. And then there is the back end of a 16-inch 45 caliber gun, obviously with the breech open. The barrel itself is of course visible there inside the arc of that bit of copper piping, but you've got the recoil absorption mechanisms, the training and elevating mechanisms, etc., and the overall breech block itself, which is obviously all around it. Now, having exited the turret and come out back onto the fantail, I was asked what order did I want to see things, and what things did I want to see. Now, of course, I couldn't resist the opportunity to say, well, can I go up as high as I possibly can? Which they said, yep, that's absolutely fine. Probably best to start off at the top, then we can gradually work our way down. And so we did. Now, something that wasn't immediately apparent to me, because of course this was my first battleship, but which did become apparent as I went on to visit North Carolina and various Iowas, is just how compact the South Dakotas are, because of course they had to fit 16-inch guns and armour against 16-inch guns into 35,000 tons. The North Carolinas had been designed to be proof against their own guns, but the original North Carolina guns, of course, were 14-inch weapons, and so they could afford to be a bit more generous with the hull because they didn't need as much weight towards armour. On the South Dakotas, within the same displacement, they had to up the protection as well as a few other things, and so they had to compact down the hull to keep the displacement down. And one of the little artifacts of that is this very narrow side walkway past the starboard 5-inch battery to get forward so that you can go up. Now, one thing you definitely get a sense of if you're lucky enough to head up through the superstructure is that you very rapidly start to feel like you're in the same set of rooms every time you go up a level. They're just getting slightly smaller. And you also notice there's a bunch of stuff being stored, like we just saw there, radar spare parts and so forth. And so as you head up and up, one thing that's a common feature you'll always notice is that one side of the room that you're in has a curve to it. There's some seats here for people to use, and here's that curve again. And initially you might think, what the heck is this thing? It's got cables going into it, and it seems to be a central feature of the ship, at least within the forward superstructure. And this is actually an armoured tube that extends all the way up to the very top of the ship, which, amongst other things, is protecting the main cable feed from the upper fire control director heading down below decks to the fire control rooms. It's not going to stop a battleship shell from penetrating it, but it will protect it from blast and splinter effect, a feature that was not present on some of Massachusetts' potential opponents. But sooner or later you reach this hatch, and then you open the hatch, and you get this view. And wow, that is some view, but that is just looking aft. So let's have a look forward and see what we make of it. And we now are pretty much in the highest position you can get on a South Dakota class battleship, bar the director, which is just above us, and it's only about, what, another 6 to 10 foot of additional height. So it's quite the spectacular view, especially on a day like today where you can just look over and see, well, pretty much everything. 16-inch turrets, 5-inch mounts, 40mm guns, and of course, because this is the South Dakota class, you well, we're here at the front, but you just go around the directory and you looking down aft as well. As some of you may know, I do actually suffer from a little bit of vertigo, although I suspect that's mainly due to my engineering degree, which is when the vertigo showed up, which makes me fearful of going up any tall man-made structure because I know exactly how cheap the people who built it were. But oddly enough, I actually feel perfectly safe up here. Mostly because I've seen how it's built all the way up, and it's not been built cheaply. And even though this is just mainly to stop people falling off the sides, apart from anything else, it's not exactly warped or flexed in any way, shape or form over 80 plus years. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty happy up here, and well, the view really can't be matched at this point. About the only thing that worries me now is that at some point I've got to go and try and do this on the New Jersey as well, which is going to be fun. But yeah, this is something you can't experience anywhere else. So apologies for the combination wind noise and bridge noise, but there is not a tremendous amount that portable film equipment can do to get rid of that without really expensive audio scrubbers. Nonetheless, you're right up there with some rather nice period radar arrays, which are always good to look at. And you may have seen the bridge soaring off into the heights in some of the photos taken lower down, and this gives you some idea of just how high up you've come, because you are not quite but almost level with this bridge, which is partly why you've got a lot more noise coming in. And as I mentioned, when you look down you get some really nice views. So this is looking down on top of the conning tower and the various platforms surrounding it, and you can see a whole slew of systems, spotting systems, sensor systems. Obviously there's some quad 40s scattered around. You can prize for the Orlican if you can spot that as well. And this is another feature that you'll notice comparing the two South Dakotas that are preserved, so Massachusetts and Alabama, with the Iowas and the North Carolina, the bow. So on Iowa, you can take a fairly long walk up to the very, very tip of the bow from the forwardmost gun turret, whether you're on Iowa, Missouri, New Jersey, or Wisconsin. North Carolina, slightly shorter, but there's still a fair bit to go. On Massachusetts, as you can see, the bow is very, very close to the tip of the guns in Turret 16-1. I title this picture Layered Defense in Concept and Execution, because you've got the full range of systems, again, seen from the near top of the Massachusetts. So you've got a couple of the 5-inch 38 mounts there, you've got a couple of the quad 40s, various, again, viewing positions, sensor positions, observation positions. There's a searchlight down there. You know, this is very reflective of mid to late war US Navy practice when it comes to defending the ship, because if you were to look at, say, the original design sketches for the South Dakotas, or indeed pretty much any late 1930s battleship, the vast majority of what you can see here would not have been an original feature. These things, the 5-inch battery, were always obviously included, but initial sketches would have had much, much fewer medium anti-aircraft emplacements, and they would have been quad 1.1 inch and maybe quad 50 cals, with those obviously being replaced with 20mm and 40mm as the ships were built, and then refitted even more so as the war went on. The pattern, of course, being repeated on the starboard side, which at the time that we were up there was, of course, the side that had a little bit more sunshine. So it gives you a little bit more detail and relief of what was actually happening with all these emplacements, although at the same time you do have to contrast with and compete with all the shadows, which can make, for example, this sort of centrally placed in the shot 40mm mount, if you look at it a little bit casually, you might think it's a sextuple or an octuple mount, but never mind. Being up here also puts into perspective the relative size of the other ships in Battleship Cove. Now, of course, you know, the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. over there is a relatively large destroyer for the 1940s, but even so, as you can see here, you know, compared to the bulk of the Massachusetts, which is only partially in shot, all of a sudden she looks a lot smaller than she did from down at the quayside. But as spectacular as the view is, there is one level that's slightly higher, albeit the view isn't quite as good. So, of course, it was time to head back inside very briefly and head on upwards.
Go. Okay, so here we are, that one deck higher up in the upmost fire control director, and you can see here all the electromechanical systems. So we've got target bearing training, lenses to look through. There are some viewports up here as well, but we're not going to try opening those. And of course, this being the single highest point in the ship can all be rotated, because it's not much good being fixed at our current bearing unless we really are just charging headlong at somebody and we want to shoot them straight ahead. So this thing has to be able to rotate 360 degrees, which it can actually do. And of course, behind all of this equipment that you can see in front of you is yet another rangefinder. It's a bit smaller than the one in the Battleship's main turret, but it does have the same kind of view lenses and all the trading mechanisms, etc. Although unlike the ones in the turrets, which can swing somewhat independently of the turret itself, because of course you have to have the direct line of sight to your target, but the guns themselves have to lead the target. This thing is not directly connected to any gun turret. It just provides data to them, and so instead of leading the guns or the guns leading the rangefinder slightly, if you want to point at a target, this entire mounting here will just rotate. And when you see just how much equipment is in here, you realise this is why the placement of fire control towers is so important in battleship design, because there's a lot of heavy equipment up here and we're well over 100 feet above the waterline. If you start sticking armour or lots of these things high up, you're going to have some serious stability issues. And so you need to compact as much equipment as possible into as lightweight as possible and into as few mountings as possible, although there is obviously the vulnerability of, if this thing gets taken out, then you may have issues. But that's why you have backup systems further down where they'll cause less stability issues. Literally the only way you could possibly get higher in the ship is via a small ladder at the back here, which does go to what looks like the world's smallest hatch. Looks about to be the same size as a large shoebox, which presumably will stick you on top of the director. But since, of course, the top of the director is not designed with safety rail systems, I'm not going to be stupid and go out there and probably get blown off into Fall River, because I like life.
Now, descending our way out of the superstructure, we went via this little galley area, this combat control and information room, and down via one of the steering positions. And while we're in one of the steering positions, we got a note over the PA saying that the ship would be closing in 15 minutes, which of course we all duly ignored. Some consequences to that would be experienced later, but that is for later in the video. There were, of course, also a bunch of people who'd come to say hi, a few people who'd also, already been at Salem and Constitution, sort of following us down the East Coast. So we obviously had a really good meet-up with all of you subscribers as well. But, for obvious reasons, not going to show people's faces without their permission. So enjoy this steering wheel for the minute. Now, on our way further down into the ship, we came across this area. Now, you might notice, well, there's a red outlined hole in the ceiling. That's probably not supposed to be there, and you would be correct. It is not supposed to be there. This was damage that Massachusetts took during Operation Torch, which has been highlighted for the purposes of people visiting.
So here we are below decks, forward in USS Massachusetts, and of course her first taste of action, indeed her first major deployment, was to Operation Torch, where she took part in the Battle of Casablanca. She obviously fired on the French battleship Jean Bart. She was fired at by a number of French ships, but also by a number of French shore batteries, including the shore battery of El Hank. Now, it wasn't all one-sided. We've already seen up on the upper deck there was a shell from Jean Bart, which arrived aboard, but down here is where another shell from the El Hank battery arrived. So if we look up above our heads, they're marked in red. Well, that's where the shell arrived through the deck, and all around us there are all these little red squares showing where various bits and pieces of the shell exploding actually hit various parts of the compartment. And there's not the shell that arrived, because obviously the shell that arrived turned into many small pieces, but there's an 8-inch shell which is the same as the one that arrived, and this is that bit of deck from up there. So Nice big chunk of armour. I'm going to spin it round. So that's the entry point from outside, and this is the bit that we would have seen if for some reason we'd been down here and lived to tell the tale. And again, you can see, even though this is an 8-inch shell, the sheer amount of energy involved, because obviously this is a solid piece of steel, not only has it been bowed in, but you can see from the way that it's been deformed that the heat and energy going through, this isn't just tearing them into the metal, this metal has actually run and deformed more like a liquid than a solid, which is characteristic of incredibly high energy impacts, where you start to think less and less about general solid physics and you actually have to start thinking about things as fluid mechanics, which is a very fun part of engineering to get into, especially when you're trying to get your head around the idea that several inches of solid steel actually tend to flow around high energy impactors rather than break in the manner of a pane of glass or something similar to that.
On display down here is this photo, which was taken of a bunch of crewmen looking at the damage up on deck afterwards. There's something I just love about this photo. Everyone just crowding around looking at the splinter damage like, yep, that ain't gonna buff out. We're gonna need some rather heavy duty work to make that all look spick and span. Everyone's just staring at it. The good news for everybody who was below at this point was, of course, that we were standing on the main armour deck, so although that upper level deck that we saw a bit of was relatively thick, it wasn't the main protective deck, and, well, this was kind of characteristic of the bits and pieces that were taken out of the main protective deck by the incoming fire, and considering just how thick a South Dakota class's main armour deck is, you can tell, although that this did a fair bit of damage to the compartment that the shell arrived in, there wasn't a tremendous risk of the shell getting any lower. Now, on our way down to the machinery spaces, we pass through this area, which, for those of you who are familiar with South Dakota's misfortunes at the naval action off Guadalcanal, well, on the right, there's a breaker board. Not the breaker board, just a breaker board. Now imagine in the middle of the night with the ship shaking around you from impact and the distinct smell of smoke, plus the recoil, of course, for your own guns firing. Imagine all of these breakers merrily clicky-clacking on their merry way to short-circuiting most of the ship, and you having to play, 6 foot by 4 foot whack-a-mole trying to get them all back in place. And then you realise that's just one of them. Yeah, now you realise what kind of a problem the electricians on South Dakota had. Now, we did stop by the fire control section, but as I said, hopefully in early 2023, I will be recording a whole section about fire control with Dr. Skull, so I'm not going to show that section just yet. Instead, we're going to go straight down into the machinery spaces, and here you can see some of the machinery. And, these are the single largest spaces within the ship, but you wouldn't know it in any particular position because it's so crammed full of different bits and pieces of equipment. Now, as you go through these photos, you may notice areas where stuff evidently was bolted before and no longer is, pipes that seem to go nowhere, and various systems that seem to have bits missing off of them. Well, that's because Massachusetts went into reserve after the Second World War, and she was never fully recommissioned, but when the Iowas were recommissioned, there was a lot of commonality with machinery parts in the South Dakotas and the Iowas. Admittedly, there was a lot of stuff that also wasn't common, but various naval crews got sent down to the reserve battleships and told to take basically anything they could that looked useful. And so poor old Massachusetts crew these days have been trying to patch together what was left of the machinery spaces after various Iowa crews decided to make off with most of it. And unfortunately, from a ship preservation status point of view, a good chunk of the stuff that turned out to not be compatible between the South Dakotas and the Iowas, but was removed anyway, ended up just getting chucked in the 80s and early 90s. And so whilst you obviously have multiple machinery spaces, because you've got to have boilers and turbines serving each of Massachusetts 4 propeller shafts, they're probably, as a long-term mission, probably only going to be able to patch together one of them in mostly working order for visitors, if they're lucky, because there just aren't that many parts left out there, unfortunately. Although one thing that was quite interesting I found was this little table, which shows you just how much fuel consumption goes up as speed increases. So this is kind of a major point to look at when someone asks, well, why didn't the battleships just go charging around at full speed or even half speed? Well, you can see the fuel consumption at 24 knots compared to the fuel consumption at 12 knots. Yeah, you're not going to be sailing for too many days on that latter fuel consumption figure. But something else you'll find down here besides boilers and turbines is, of course, the reduction gearing. And this is part of the housing for the reduction gearing, with all these little hatches, meaning that you can get access to specific parts of it. Of course, this is a very substantial housing compared to that found on smaller ships. The hatches are also secured by padlocks because it turns out if there's one thing you can do to a turbine-driven ship, whether it be a battleship, cruiser, destroyer, whatever, to make it not go places you don't want it to go, like say if you don't want to go out on deployment, it's to feed something even as simple as a piece of 2x4 into the reduction gearing. Yeah, do that on an active warship and, well, the US Navy would not have been a very happy bunny with you at all. But they've taken off some of the hatches there so that you can actually see some of the reduction gearing itself, but the actual strapping remains. Because some of those padlocks, again, the keys have somewhat gone AWOL. Elsewhere in the machinery spaces, though, and this is a site, well, some of these other sites I suspect will be familiar to some viewers, but this site I suspect will be very, very familiar to certain viewers. This is part of the ship's boiler array, and you notice there's that little, what looks like a pipe with a 90-degree red faucet type attachment on it, lying there on the tray. Well, it's nothing of the sort. You see, now that we're in the boiler section, where all the steam pressure is generated to drive the turbines, which turn the reduction gears, which turn the propeller shafts, which turn the propellers themselves, each boiler features multiple of these little burner attachments. You can see this one is made by Babcock and Wilcox and obviously is an original part of the ship. That nameplate above there, if you can read it, says 1940. So that's when this particular unit was manufactured, because obviously they have to be manufactured long before they're installed in the ship, and installing the machinery in the ship long predates the ship entering service. So although USS Massachusetts enters service in 1942, her machinery is already 2 years old by this point. Now, on almost every large US museum ship you'll come across, if you're able to get access to this part of the machinery spaces, you'll notice lots of these little things. We pointed them out earlier. Now, what these actually are burner tubes, because as it turns out, with this particular type of power plant, if you want to increase speed, you also have to change the tube, which adjusts the amount of oil that's being sprayed into the boiler, at least as it was explained to me. So it's not just a simple case of, you know, the up top on the bridge, they ring up, okay, we want full ahead, and everyone just going, open a couple of valves and off we go. No, as you're increasing speed, let's say you were cruising at 12 or 14 knots, as you step up through the speed regimens, you're going to be changing these out as well, and you're going to have multiple crew changing them out on multiple burner points across multiple boilers. And that would be done in a manner somewhat similar to this. So you have to unlock it, pull it free, obviously replace it with a different one. I'm not going to do that in this case, but then it goes back in again, cap comes down, and then the lock goes back on, and it's ready to go. So coming out of the machinery spaces, and don't worry, we'll be looking at that kind of power plant quite a lot in these this series of videos, we come instead to the magazines. So here are a bunch of accumulator tanks, which, as the name suggests, help store up pressure so that everything can be rotated. And you can see in the back there a passing through chamber for the charges. Now, unlike the ones on Salem, these are horizontal for reasons that we shall shortly explain. But before we do that, you will notice these things, and you can see they've quite helpfully put bits of foam on the edges so that those of you who, like myself, who are a little bit taller won't smack your head on them all the time. Now, if you've watched Battleship New Jersey's channel or a number of the other historical museum ship channels, you'll know that this is part of the rail system that allows them to move heavy objects, like, say, super heavy armor-piercing shells, around through various parts of the ship. But of course, this here is a door, bulkhead door, and you can see there the Z on the side, or Z in American, and that signifies that when the ship is in combat, this has to be shut. So how do you square the circle of having a continuous rail system so that you can move heavy objects around, with that system having to be interrupted at every bulkhead and hatchway because you need to make the ship as watertight as possible in combat? Well, you saw the gap there, and that gap is not just for display purposes. That gap is there because this is the missing bit of rail. So that rail can actually be detached, removed, and as you can see here, stored inside the charge handling chamber whilst the ship is under battle conditions. And then once the ship is in calm conditions again, you can open that bulkhead hatch and you can restore it to its place and you can start trucking heavy things around again. But whilst we're talking about heavy things that need to be carted around down here in the charge handling area.
So here's a set of charges. These individually weighed 90 pounds as the real ones, so that's just between 40 and 45 kilos for those of you working metric. These are training ones because, you know, it's a responsible museum ship. They're not going to leave several hundred pounds of powder lying out in the open. So the training ones weigh a little bit more. Only a little bit though, they're about 100 pounds. And as you can see, the rollers allow you to move these around pretty easily. I can move them around with one hand. But when these things get to where you have to pass them through into the magazine, you have to do this. And obviously, if this thing weighs 90 to 100 pounds, the handle's there, but pick it up but you think the canvas is going to last. So you have to kind of apparently do this kind of thing. That is quite a hefty weight, and then you imagine that's one of 6, and it's all explosive that's going to be sending one of those shells very, very, very far away. So I like to call it the shell be gone technique.
Now at the other end of that set of runners, and then having been passed through the interlocks, they end up here. So this is 6 charges on the shell hoist ready to go up to supply one of the main guns. However, you can also see on the right there some tall metal cases. Now these are the charge storage cases, and those are actually obviously in the magazines themselves. So let's go and have a look at how those operate.
So we're in the powder magazine, or one of the powder magazines for Massachusetts. We're on the upper level. There is another one just below us. And you might think, well, this doesn't look like a powder charge. This looks like a 55-gallon drum with a complicated lid. And that's because in the US Navy, they were sensible enough not to store massive amounts of propellant in something that was very easily vulnerable to flash, because, you know, they like their ships in one piece. So if you want to get the charges out, you need the special tool, and then you have to crank it like so. Then you remove lid, and in there's currently nothing, but in there would be 3 charges, each of which 90 pounds of explosive. So you need to empty 2 of these for a single gun, which means you need to empty 6 of these just to fire 1 turret once. And then once you've got your powder out, lock that back up again because you don't want a lid running around. And that's what keeps the explosive safe. So in theory, at least, even if somehow a round finds its way down here and there's a big flash and an explosion, or possibly more likely the barbette or the turret is penetrated and flash comes down from there, which is, I mean, it's still fairly unlikely, but it's more likely than a shell getting its way directly to here. In theory, even if you have some kind of flash going off in here, flash doesn't last very long. This metal covering and the wrapper should protect the charges, and hopefully you'll just end up with a small fire and not a good chunk of your ship disappearing into the ether.
And so that concludes the abbreviated highlights of the sort of 6-hour tour of Massachusetts that I managed to get under my belt early on in the US tour in April. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. As I said, please do make sure to go and visit Fall River and Battleship Cove if at all you can. If you can't and you'd still like to support the ship, then their website, which will be in the video description below, has a variety of ways you can support them either directly or buy a bit of merchandise from them, like a hat. I'm collecting hats from all the ships I've visited. I have a noble amassment of hat by this point. But yes, again, so once again, many thanks to Megan Rathburn, the executive director, for letting me aboard in the first place. Many thanks to Dr. Scholes and the other docents for showing me around, even though we did end up happily in the ship well after closing time. They ended up having to send a security guard after us, and that's a whole other story that is best told live. But nonetheless, it was an incredibly enjoyable trip. I learned a huge amount. As I said, there are huge sections that I've left out of this. The whole visit to the fire control section, a big chunk of the stuff in the machinery spaces, the shell handling area as opposed to the charge handling area, and so on and so forth. But that's why you need to go and visit. And it also gives me other things to talk about later on. So, USS Massachusetts, the first ever battleship I've visited, and certainly not something to be forgotten in a hurry anytime soon. So, next time, we are going to be further south and looking at USS Olympia before we head over, of course, to the second battleship I've ever visited, USS New Jersey. That's going to be a fun time. So, see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.